Okay, so today we're going to be learning about the nervous system, and we're going to go just a brief overview today about what makes up the nervous system, and then in the next few days we'll get more in depth about how it all actually works. So this next slide is actually a little game I'd like you to play. It just has to do with reaction time, which deals a lot with our central nervous system and how our brain processes information and tells our muscles what to do. So I'll put this on OneNote as well. The PowerPoint will be there as well if you want to just go to this slide. However, if you want to actually just go right to the game, I'll put the link on OneNote as well. So there are two main divisions to the central nervous system. We have the central nervous system, which will be short formed a lot to CNS. So if you ever see that, that's what that means, central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have our peripheral nervous system, which will be short formed a lot to PNS. PNS is all of the other parts of the nervous system. So essentially, your central nervous system are the two main components, so that's your brain and your spinal cord. And then every other pathway of the nervous system is part of your peripheral. So if you think of your periphery, okay, that's usually like your extremities, so it'll be any signals that are being transmitted either from your brain to your spinal cord or from your spinal cord to the rest of your body. That's all going to be your peripheral nervous system. So this is just a broad overview of everything we're going to look at within the nervous system. So over here we have our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system, so the two we just talked about. And our central nervous system has to do with the brain and our spinal cord. Okay, so the brain is what receives and processes sensory information. It initiates responses, it stores memories, and generates thoughts and emotions. So just generally, that's what the brain takes care of. Your spinal cord is what's actually going to conduct the signals to and from the brain. So it's going to receive signals from your body and send them to the brain, and it's also going to take messages from the brain and send them to the rest of your body. Okay, and it also controls reflex activities. So we're going to get more into that later on in the lesson. But anything that is a straight reflex that you're not really necessarily thinking about, your brain doesn't have time to process it, that's considered a reflex activity. Now your peripheral nervous system is made up of several different neurons. So we have what we call motor neurons, and motor neurons are central nervous system to our muscles and our glands. So these are the messages that are going to be sent from our central nervous system to our muscles or to our glands to tell them to do something. And the other kind is sensory neurons. And so these are the ones that are going to sense what's going on around them, sense what's going on inside of you, and it's going to send that message to your central nervous system to perform some sort of act. So this one is leaving the central nervous system and going to the muscles and glands. That's your motor neurons. Your sensory neurons are going to be sending messages from your organs, from your sensory organs to your central nervous system. Now your motor neurons also will be divided up into two different types of systems. We have what we call a somatic nervous system, and our somatic nervous system is what controls all your voluntary movements. So voluntary meaning you choose whether you do them or not. So whether you flex your arm or whether you decide to grab the pen, those are all things that are voluntary. So your somatic nervous system would control those. Your autonomic nervous system is what controls all your involuntary responses. So for instance, if you just ate something, your body is going to go ahead and start to digest that, and that's not a voluntary movement for you. That's something that your body's just going to do naturally. So your stomach muscles will be contracting and your esophagus is going to be pushing food down to the stomach. All those things are involuntary. So you don't have an option of choosing whether to do that or not to do that. Within your autonomic nervous system, we have a sympathetic division, and your sympathetic division mostly has to do with your fight or flight response. And your parasympathetic division has to do with your rest or digest. And what that means is sympathetic division is whenever you are faced with some type of danger or you're faced with some sort of circumstance where you need to either be in a fight or flight type scenario. So your body's going to react accordingly for that. Your parasympathetic division is they call it the rest or digest, and that just means that if you're not with any great danger, you're just kind of going through life normally, you're just digesting, you're digesting, breathing, things like that. Your parasympathetic division is what's going to be working there. This next slide is just another diagram that's going to show similar to what I just went over. So specifically we're talking about your central nervous system here and your peripheral nervous system here, okay? And it just explains what goes into the central nervous system, what goes into the peripheral nervous system. It's going to talk about your motor division. Remember, the motor is what's going to carry the messages from your central nervous system to your peripheral tissues and systems, meaning it's just going to tell your body to do something in response to something that it received. Okay, the sensory division is what is going to sense the information from either within your body or outside of your body and send that message to the central nervous system to give it some type of response. Okay, so if you want to just pause the video for a second, have a look through this, go through the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and what those things are. And I'm going to go over each one in a bit more detail. So we have two basic type of systems. We have an afferent system, and our afferent system receives input through receptors and transmits the input to the central nervous system. So our afferent system is what's going to receive some type of message through your receptors, whether that's outside of, so if it's on your skin and it's feeling the temperature, or if it's something that's happening inside of your body. So for instance, if your blood glucose level is low, those receptors will send that message to the central nervous system to tell your body to release glucagon. Okay, so your afferent system is what's going to receive the input through the receptors and then send that message to the central nervous system. Okay, and your efferent system is what's going to carry the signals to the effectors. And your effectors are essentially just whatever does the work. Okay, so in this case, we're saying muscles and glands. So it's going to take that signal that it received from the central nervous system and it's going to send it off to the effectors. Okay, so efferent goes with effectors. So the effectors are the things that actually perform the work. So our central nervous system consists of specifically the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so it's how these two are going to interact in order to receive and to send messages. And what they do is they integrate and process information sent by the nerves. Okay, so the nerves are going to receive a signal. They're going to transmit that signal to your brain and your spinal cord to then, again, perform some sort of action. Our peripheral nervous system can be divided into the afferent or the sensory system. And you remember, if your afferent system, it's going to receive input through the receptors. So these could be receptors on your skin, in your eyes, in your ears, your internal receptors in your organs, etc. And they're going to transmit that input to the central nervous system. Okay, so you're going to receive an input from your receptors. So if your skin feels that it is hot, okay, so it is, perhaps touching something that's too warm and it wants to send that message to the brain to tell your body to remove it, that's your efferent, or your afferent system. So that's going to send that message from your receptors and send it to the central nervous system. And then your efferent, which is your motor system, it's going to carry the signals to the effectors. Okay, so in this case, the muscles and the glands. So it's going to take that information that it just received from the afferent system and it's going to send it through the efferent system to tell the muscles and the glands to do something. So whether that's to release a hormone or whether that's to contract your muscles. So if your skin receptors are saying that you're cold, it's going to send that message to the effectors to say, okay, you need to start contracting, causing you to shiver, and the shivering will cause your body to do work, and that will create some heat for you. Your efferent system can be further subdivided into what we call the somatic system. So the somatic system is what communicates with the skeletal system, okay, or your skeletal muscle. So your somatic system will communicate specifically with your skeleton, and this is voluntary, so we control this. So anything that has to do with somatic is going to be voluntary movements. So for instance, if I decide that I want to walk across the room, that's going to be communicated through my somatic system. If I decide that I am sensing danger and I want to run away, again, that is going to be my somatic system. Your autonomic system is any type of automatic regulation of some type of muscle or gland in your body. Okay, so the automatic regulation, meaning I'm not necessarily controlling that, I'm not choosing to do it. The smooth muscle in my stomach is going to be contracting whether if I eat or not. The cardiac muscle, my heart beating, okay, so when it's contracting, it's going to be doing that regardless of whether I decide that I want it to or not. Okay, and the only way you can make it stop is if you cause your heart to stop. Okay, so otherwise, it's a system that will just carry on without you. You don't necessarily need to control it. Okay, so for instance, digestion, circulation of blood, secretion of hormones, you can't really control when those hormones are secreted. Okay, your body will do all that for you. So that's the autonomic system. And we call this involuntary. So involuntary means you have no control over whether these things happen or not. They just happen based on what your body is sensing around it. So with our autonomic nervous system, remember those are the ones that we have no control over. It can be also further subdivided into what we call the sympathetic division. And the sympathetic division, if you remember from the beginning of the lesson, is something that dominates in situations that involve stress, danger, excitement, or strenuous physical activity. Okay, so we tend to call this our fight or flight division. So this is anything where you are in great danger. You could be very excited, and it's going to release those endorphins. And those endorphins, you again don't get to choose whether they get released or not. They just do. Specifically with strenuous physical activity, some people call it, the runner's high. So when you get a runner's high, you get this big release of endorphins when you get to a specific point in your workout, and that causes you to, it's a happy feeling, and it causes you to want to keep going. Okay, so the sympathetic division isn't always necessarily just in dangerous situations, but it can be anything that, whether you're dealing with stress or danger, or there's pure excitement, or if you're going through strenuous physical activity, that division will kick in. So again, you don't have control over that. Your body will just release those hormones for you. So what it does cause you to do is it causes your heart rate to increase. Okay, so if I'm in a dangerous situation, I want my heart rate to increase because that is going to allow me to get oxygen to my muscles. And if I can get oxygen to my muscles and get rid of the carbon dioxide, I'm going to be more efficient, and I'll be able to go through cellular respiration more quickly, which will allow me to, again, either run away if I need to do that, or if I need to fight, or if I need to perform some sort of physical activity, I need my heart rate to increase. Okay, when your heart rate increases, your blood pressure is also going to increase. So it's called vasoconstriction. So that causes our blood to be able to be pumped faster and harder to everywhere I need it in my body. It dilates the air passages in your lungs. It increases your sweating, and it dilates your pupils. So dilating, remember, means to get larger. So if your pupils dilate, that allows more light to get in. And if you allow more light to get in, that's going to allow you to see in situations, in darker situations. So for instance, if it's nighttime, and you feel like you are under attack or there's a potential danger in the area, your pupils will dilate naturally. And what that does is it allows more light to come in, and so you'll actually be able to see better in the dark. Your parasympathetic division is what dominates in quiet, low stress situations. So this is when you're just relaxed. So if you're sitting on the couch and you're just watching TV, that's your parasympathetic division kicking in. Okay, most of you sitting in class right now would definitely be dealing with the parasympathetic division. And we tend to call this the rest or digest division. So these are all the different things that happen in your body when you're dealing with your parasympathetic division, and also when you're dealing with your sympathetic division. So remember, your sympathetic division is going to be your fight or flight type of response. So it's going to dilate your pupils. So just like we talked about before, it's going to let more light in. It inhibits saliva production. So you don't necessarily need to be worried about tasting food or lubricating your food when you're in a dangerous situation. It tends to also be why when you're exercising strenuously, you can tend to feel very dry, and that's because your body is inhibiting that saliva. It dilates your bronchi, so it's going to again make these two bronchi branches here. It's going to make them dilate more, which will cause them to open up so you can get more air in and out, which again is helpful in a fight or flight type response. It accelerates your heart rate, stimulates epinephrine and norepinephrine release, and we'll talk more about what those specific hormones do in your body, but specifically epinephrine is a stimulant, and it's going to cause a lot of the same reactions that's happening here already. It stimulates glucose release. Again, we need that glucose so that we can go through cellular respiration to make that happen faster. It's going to inhibit your stomach, pancreas, and intestines. So again, our body, if we're in a fight or flight type situation, we don't want to be worried about digesting food or, creating any type of digestion there. So it's just going to inhibit all those things so that we can focus just on our cells, getting our lungs prepped, getting our heartbeat prepped. It's going to focus more on that. It's going to inhibit urination, again, for the same reason. So we don't want to have to think about, going to the washroom, or we don't want to be urinating at that point. We want to make sure that all of our energy is being put into where we need it. And it promotes ejaculation and vaginal contractions as well. So that has to do more with the excitement part of it, in that you are going to be potentially feeling some of these same feelings if you are having sex with someone. And so that system will also increase your heart rate and dilate your bronchi and all those things, and it promotes ejaculation as well. Now, with the parasympathetic division, basically does a lot of the opposite. So it's going to constrict your pupils. So if your pupils just at rest are a normal size, it's going to stimulate saliva production. So again, we want to be able to taste our food and to be able to lubricate our food so we can swallow it. It's going to constrict your bronchi to a regular level. It's going to slow your heart rate down. It allows your stomach, your pancreas, and your intestines to work again, stimulates urination, and promotes erection of the genitals. So with our nerve cells now, we're going to be specifically looking at the anatomy of the nerve cell and how they're made up and how they work. So there's two different types of cells that make up nerve tissue. We have what we call glial cells, and glial cells are any type of support cell. So meaning they don't specifically conduct electrical signals. So all of the neurons in our brain and all the different nerve cells, those are actually conducting electrical signals that are sending messages back and forth. Our glial cells are just there to support that system, okay? So they don't actually conduct electrical signals themselves. What they do is they provide nutrition and support to the neurons. And they are involved in nerve cell metabolism. So metabolism has to do with all of the chemical reactions that are happening within a nerve cell, and so they help with that process. Neurons themselves are the actual functional cells. So most of what we're going to focus on specifically in this lesson, but also in future lessons, is the neuron. Okay, and that's this crazy looking thing over here. Okay, so the neurons, it's a specialized nerve cell, and it allows an organism to receive and respond to both internal and external stimuli. So meaning these different ends of the two, of the nerve cell, of the neuron specifically. Okay, so this end is going to receive signals. Okay, over here we're going to talk about what each of these processes are. And they send that message to the body, which is the main area here, which is the nucleus. The message is going to be sent down the axon, okay? And then it's going to be sent out here to the next neuron, okay? So what it's going to do, it's going to receive signals up near the top, up near here, and then it's going to respond to different stimuli by sending electrical signals throughout your body. Okay, there are three main types of neurons that we're going to look at. There are afferent neurons, and if you remember from previously, afferent has to do with the sensory. So it's going to be detecting stimuli from your internal and external environment, and it's going to send those messages to your central nervous system. So photoreceptors, photo means light, so it's going to detect whether there is light in a situation or not, and that can affect whether your pupils dilate or constrict. We've got chemoreceptors, so it's going to be looking for chemicals. usually within your body, and thermoreceptors, again, that has to do with heat. So it's going to be on your skin and on your glands and things like that, sensing whether your body is at the appropriate temperature. We have interneurons, and interneurons is what's going to basically play mediator between the afferent neurons and the efferent neurons. So it's going to relay impulses between the sensory and the motor neurons. Okay, so it's going to, the sensory ones are the ones that receive the signal and send it to the central nervous system. Specifically, it's going to give it to the interneurons, and the interneurons are then going to send it to the motor neurons, and it's going to say, okay, we need you to go ahead and do this. And these are found mainly in the brain and in the spinal cord. So I'll show you a picture in a minute of where the afferent meets up with the interneurons, and then the interneurons will then send the message to the motor neurons. Finally, your efferent neurons, they are going to relay instructions from your interneurons to your muscles, organs, and glands to produce responses. So essentially, they're going to receive the signal from the afferent neurons. The afferent neurons send it to the interneurons will send it to the motor neurons or the efferent neurons, and they will do whatever the afferent neurons is telling it to do. So depending on the response that it needs to happen. So all neurons share the following common structural features. So we have a cell body. Okay, so the cell body, if you look down here, oops, sorry, I drew over it. So your cell body here, okay, so the cell body is this general area here. Your cell body is what contains your nucleus and other important organelles. So if you look here, you can see your nucleus. Okay, the nucleus is on the inside, and this whole thing here is called the cell body. It is what synthesizes most of the neuron's proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. So remember, it needs these macromolecules in order to survive. So this is in the cell body, this is where the majority of that happens. Then we have something called the dendrites, and the dendrites are right here. And the dendrites are these branchy looking things here, okay, that are going to receive the signals and transmit them towards the cell body. So these dendrites are actually what receives the signal. Either it's usually from another neuron, so a lot of these neurons will just connect kind of end to end, and these dendrites will receive messages from the previous neuron and then send them along this way. But it's going to take the message that it receives, and it's going to pass them down in here into the cell body. So it's going to receive the signal, send it to the nucleus. The nucleus will then decide what to do with that. Okay, and the last part is probably the one we're going to spend the most amount of time talking about, which is called the axon. And the axon is what carries nerve signals away from the nerve cell body. Okay, so remember the cell body was this whole structure here. So it's going to transmit nerve signals away from the cell body. Okay, so it's going to travel down this big long pathway here, which is the axon. They vary in size from micrometers all the way up to a meter in length. Okay, so they obviously have a very, the ones that are inside your brain and in specific spots are going to be very small in comparison to ones that will run kind of the length of your spinal cord. So those would be some of the longer ones. So axons are so thin that more than 100 axons can be placed inside of a human hair. So you can imagine how small and how thin these axons actually are. We have portions of the axon are coated in a white sheet of fatty protein called the myelin sheath. Okay, so if you look down here, the myelin sheath, that's kind of this greenish type area here. And what it is, it's a sheet that has to, it basically protects the signal. Okay, so we say that it acts as an insulator that prevents the ions from diffusing off the nerve cells. So essentially what's happening here is that there's a electrical signal that's being passed all the way down through the axon. Okay, and it's kind of like your wire. So if you're thinking about your headphones, and if you didn't have that plastic coating on it, all the electrons would essentially be jumping off your wires, and it wouldn't be a very effective or efficient system. If you've ever had a kind of a break in some of your headphones where that connection is loose, sometimes you can hear it crackling and the sound quality is not as good. So what the myelin sheath does is essentially acts as that type of insulator, and it allows the electrical signal to pass down through the axon without being interrupted by those ions or those electrons popping off. And the myelin sheath itself is formed by those glial cells. Remember, glial cells are the ones that don't actually transmit signals, they just support the neurons. And those glial cells are called Schwann cells. Okay, so the myelin sheath itself is made up of a type of cells called Schwann cells. Okay, we also have a area between the myelin sheath. So you'll notice that there's little gaps here. Okay, so all these little gaps are what we call nodes of Ranvier. Okay, and again, this was obviously some person that found that out, and so he named them after himself. But these little gaps here actually help transmit the signal. So what happens is that the nerve impulses, I'm just going to erase some of this stuff. There we go. So the nerve impulses will actually jump from one node to the next. Okay, so they don't necessarily go through where these myelin sheath are. They're going to kind of jump from one to one. And this is happening so fast that it doesn't really seem like a jump. It kind of just seems like it's running through it. But it actually allows that movement to speed up. Okay, and we want these processes to be very fast. We don't want to necessarily be waiting for our brain to process something each time we need to, do some sort of motion, or our gland needs to secrete something. So these nerve impulses will jump from one to the next, and that helps speed up the movement of those impulses, which again is very beneficial for us. So the nerves themselves, most nerves are comprised of many, many neurons bunched together. So if you look down here at this drawing, okay, you can see that each one of these little sections here, those are all individual neurons. Okay, so if we blow that up, if we look over here, so here is our cell body and our dendrites. Okay, so this is the axon. This is where the nerve signal is going to be transmitted all the way down. Okay, and it's going to end up down at the end. Okay, if we look at that a little bit closer, this is one single neuron here. Okay, and you can see that that's one dot of many within this whole nerve. So each one of these little circle section here is a bundle of nerve fibers, and then all of those bundles together is what we call a nerve. So each one of these nerves, okay, so each one of these blue circles over here on the left actually is made up of this whole system here. Okay, so within each one of these, and this is blown up an incredible amount. This is using an electron microscope, so you can see some of the smallest things. Because remember, we said that there would be over 100 axons within a single length of hair, right? So these neurons here fit into each of these dots in here. These bundles of nerve fibers will fit into a large nerve. So our nerves actually contain many, 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 many neurons within it. Okay, so we're going to be looking at impulses in general. We will be looking at this in a lot more detail in the next coming lessons, but we'll just kind of give you a brief overview. So the neurons will use electrical signals to communicate with other neurons, muscles, or glands. So in this drawing here, you can see here the connection between the axon of the previous neuron and then the dendrites of the second neuron. So in this case, we're actually sending a message from one neuron to the next. And same thing here. Here's another connection between the previous neuron and the next neuron. So these signals will get passed along all these different neurons all the way until you get to either the central nervous system, or if it's a central nervous system, sending a message to your peripheral nervous system telling your body to do something. This whole idea is called a nerve impulse. Okay, so sending that electrical signal down one neuron to the next. And it involves changes in electric charges across the cell's plasma membrane. So how we actually pass that electrical signal on has to do with the different charges that we're giving inside and outside of the nerve cell. So we'll be going over that in lots of detail, so don't worry too much about that yet. However, one thing that you can't really tell from a lot of the pictures is that the neurons are not actually directly connected. There's a meeting point between the two neurons, and that area is called a synapse. So if you look down here, this is the end of one neuron. Okay, so this is we call the terminal. So if you can kind of zoom in a little bit here, this is kind of the end of the one, and we're connecting with the next one. And this membrane over here is where the next neuron is. Okay, so we call this we call the initial one the presynaptic one. So presynaptic just means it's the thing before the synapse, and then we call this one the postsynaptic. That just means it's after the synapse. So this area right in here, okay, is what we call the synapse. So it's this gap that we have in between the two neurons. So they don't actually physically touch each other. They have this gap and they have to send little messages through. So the gap itself is called the synaptic cleft. Okay, so the gap between the axon of one and the dendrite of another is called that cleft. So this whole area here is listed here in the drawing, synaptic cleft. So a synapse is made up of your presynaptic terminal. Okay, so pre, remember, is the one before the synapse. And then you've got your postsynaptic terminal and the cleft. So all three of these things together make up your synapse. And the impulse is carried to the end of the axon. Okay, so that would be in this general area here. So the signal is going to be carried all the way down your axon, and it's going to get to the end here. And what happens is that all these little dots here, all these little dots are called neurotransmitters. Okay, and your neurotransmitters are released into the extracellular environment. Extracellular just means outside of the cell. So it's going to be released from this area, and it's going to be released into this cleft area, into this space. And what they do is they bind with receptors. This drawing, even though it's a little simplistic, kind of shows it a bit better. So these neurotransmitters are going to be released from the presynaptic cleft, and they are going to be released into the synaptic cleft until they find a receptor. And the receptors are located on the postsynaptic membrane. So that's the next neuron or the muscle or whatever it is that's receiving that signal. Okay, so those neurotransmitters are going to bind to receptors, and then they cause the impulse to go in the next cell. So as soon as these receptors have received the neurotransmitter, it's going to then tell that signal to continue on into this next area. Okay, so the impulse will come down here, causes these neurotransmitters to be released into this environment, and then once they are on the receptors, then it's going to send the message down into that next system. Okay, so just a little more about the nerve pathways that we talked about earlier. The simplest nerve pathway is called a reflex arc. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard of reflexes before, but maybe you weren't quite sure how they actually worked. So reflex arc is important because it happens without the brain. So your brain isn't really involved in this process. It's just something that your body does naturally because it either needs to happen too fast for the brain to actually process. So if we allowed the time for the message to get all the way to our brain and then send all the way back, it perhaps could be too late. So it consists of 5 different components. So we have a receptor. So the receptor in this case is on our skin. Okay, so we have receptors. We have an afferent or a sensory neuron. So remember, that's what's going to take the signal from the receptor, and it's going to send it to the spinal cord. We have an interneuron, and the interneurons are usually found in the spinal cord, so that would be this little section right here. We have an efferent or a motor neuron, so it's going to receive the message from the interneuron and send the signal back down this way. And then we have the effector, and the effector is either the muscle or the gland or whatever it is that needs to receive that signal to say, okay, hey, you need to do this. So usually when we talk about reflex arcs, we tend to talk about kind of putting our hand on something very hot. So what happens if you accidentally touch the stove and you didn't realize it was on? Well, without your knowledge, sensory neurons in your hand are detecting a stimulus. So in this case, it detected the heat. So typically when you first put your hand on something hot, you don't realize that it's hot right away because your brain isn't actually processing it. What happens is that those neurons are going to pass the impulse to the interneurons. Remember, the interneurons are these guys right here in your actual spinal cord. So it's going to receive the message in your hand. It's It's going to send that message to your spinal cord, and the interneuron, instead of sending it all the way up your spinal cord, all the way up to your brain, it's actually just going to send a message now to your motor neuron. And your motor neuron is what controls your muscles. So it's actually going to send that message down here, and it's going to continue on until it gets to your muscle. And when it gets to your muscle, it's going to trigger an effector in your hand. Okay, so that muscle is going to contract, and it's going to tell your hand to contract and pull away from the hot object. And this all takes place within a second before a message can be received by the brain. So if you had to take that message, okay, so you put your hand on something hot, you put it on the burner, and that message had to go all the way to your spinal cord, up to your brain says, ouch, that's hot, please remove it. That message would get sent back to your motor neurons and then would then tell your muscles to contract to pull away. If you did all that, a lot of times your hand would be burnt before you could actually get it off there. So in a way, it's very good that we have these reflex arcs because it causes us to make these things happen faster. After the brain has processed this message, you will feel the pain of the burn. Okay, so once the interneuron has passed on the message to the motor neuron down here, okay, it's actually going to then send the message anyway back up to the brain. Okay, so after it's passed on, okay, motor neuron, I want you to do this, please contract the hand and remove it, it will send the message up to the brain so that your brain can either learn from it or just to process it, and that's when you start to feel the pain. So I don't know if you've ever done this before, but if you do happen to put your hand on something hot, okay, you won't notice it right away, but when you pull your hand off, okay, that's when you tend to start to feel the pain. Okay, and that's because the message has finally made its way to your brain. So reflex action is an evolutionary mechanism designed to prevent injury to the organism. So this is actually something that we have as a complex organism. It's something that we have evolved to obtain in order to prevent injury to us. Okay, so otherwise, if we had to wait till our brain processed all of our pain, we possibly would not, we certainly wouldn't be as evolved as we are today. Okay, so this is just it's the same idea, but it's just a different picture. Okay, so if I touch the hot element, it's going to send it along the afferent pathway. Okay, so it's going to be coming this way, and it's going to head into your spinal cord. Once it gets to your spinal cord, then it's going to be, the message is going to be received from our interneurons. Okay, our interneurons will sense that the receptors are saying that that is hot and we need to remove our hand. So that message will then be sent down through the efferent pathway down to our muscle, and our muscle in this case is the effector, and the effector will then contract. So you contract your biceps so that your muscle contracts, and then you can withdraw your hand, and that's the overall response of it. Okay, then that message will then get sent on to your brain so your brain can process what just happened. So these next couple slides, I have a couple of videos that are just going to go over what we just talked about with the reflex arc. If you would like more of a visual, or if you want to go over it in a bit more detail, please have a look at those. I can't actually show you on this, it won't let me click on them, but I will put the PowerPoint up so you can have a look at it on OneNote, and I'll also link the videos directly on OneNote if you want to go have a look at them. So this one's on the reflex arc. And this one here is on the reflex action and reflex arc together. So finally, just as a quick review, these questions are on your note as well. So if you could go through, just make sure you understand what the central nervous system is, what are the differences between a lot of these things that we talked about, how is your reflex arc involved in the game that you played today. So hopefully you went ahead and tried that reaction game, listing the two main cell types of nervous tissue and their functions. So these are the types of questions that I would be asking specifically with regards to the nervous system, what makes up the nervous system, and then the neuron itself you'll also have to know.